This week's Multiple Choice Monday is a shapes of molecule question. Shapes of molecules are really popular in multiple choice questions. They don't like to take up a lot of the exam paper, but they do like to put in some strange, unusual things. Okay, so it's asking which of these species is not planar. And for a planar, normally I would look for the presence of lone pairs, but actually this question is quite a challenge in terms of the shapes. It's got some really quite unusual ones. So let's have a look at each of them in turn. So A is CH3+. A lot of people think they don't really know where to take the plus from. Well, it's going to be from the central atom. We're not going to take an electron from a hydrogen because then it wouldn't be able to form a bond at all. So what that means is I know I have 3 bonds to hydrogen. I know that normally carbon would have 4 in its outer shell, but there's a positive charge, so I've removed 1, which means now all my electrons are accounted for. And that would be, therefore, 3 bonds, no lone pairs, which would make it trigonal planar. Now let's look at SO3. A little bit trickier. Oxygen needs to form 2 bonds. Sulfur can form quite a range of different numbers of covalent bonds because it can use the d orbitals, because it is in the 3rd row of the periodic table, so it's got more space than 8. It can fit more than 8 in its outer shell. So sulfur is forming, I'm just going to draw it with lines rather than dot and cross, double bonds, 3 double bonds, 1 with each oxygen. Each double bond is going to have 2 electrons from the oxygen and 2 from the sulfur. So 2 from the sulfur times 3, 6 electrons used by the sulfur means there are also no lone pairs. So basically there are 6 bonds around the sulfur, which means I've used all the electrons in bonding. What about ClO3-? Well, how this usually forms, whenever I see oxygen and I see a minus charge, it's likely that the minus charge will be on the oxygen. So that is my option when I'm thinking about shapes of molecules. Basically, oxygen can either form a double bond to something else, just calling it X, or it can form a single bond and then the oxygen has a minus charge. Oxygen is very good at sort of stabilizing and holding on to a negative charge. So ClO3- then is going to be probably a chlorine, well, obviously a chlorine. 2 of the oxygens will be double bonded, and then 1 of them will be single bonded, and the negative charge will therefore sort out the extra electron that that oxygen needs. So if I count the bonds to the chlorine, there are 5 bonds to the chlorine, but chlorine is in group 7, not in group 5. So there is 1 lone pair. If there is only 1 lone pair in any molecule, it cannot be a flat molecule because the lone pair is always going to be moving it around, unless there are only 2 bonds. Sorry, you can have sort of like a bent shape. But what that means is that will be a pyramidal shape. It will still be trigonal pyramidal, so the lone pair will be pushing down on the oxygens so that they're forming that kind of shape. It's pretty hard to do the dashes because I've drawn the double bonds, but the lone pair is on top. Okay, what about XeF4? Because you may be thinking, well, why is that flat when it has 4 things around a xenon? Well, xenon obviously is pretty unusual in terms of bond forming because it's a noble gas. So what we need to do is look at xenon and think about the electrons again. So I know that it will have 4 bonds to fluorine. Fluorine can't do anything except form single bonds. Xenon is in group 8. So when it has 4 bonds, that means it has 2 lone pairs. And so what will happen is that the lone pairs will position themselves, if you imagine that we're looking down on this now, above and below the xenon. That will get them as far apart as they can,
So the lone pairs we know repel more than bonded pairs, so they will get as far apart. They will be 180 degrees apart. So it'll be based on an octahedral with 6 things. 4 bonds, 2 lone pairs. The 2 lone pairs will arrange themselves as far apart as possible, so the fluorines will be 90 degrees apart, and that's called a square planar shape. So the answer was C. So if you want more help, don't forget I've got a free online course which is basically on essential equation skills. There are lots of exam style questions and explainer videos on my website, and you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook for more tips and revision materials.